good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My co-moderator, Tanvi Kothari, and I are delighted to extend a very warm welcome to our three panelists and to all AIB and VIBE members. This is the second interview in our new series, Paving the Way for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. This time, we are focusing on Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we are zooming in on the Auckland University of Technology's Eke Tangaroa Maori and Pacific Early Career Academic Program. Let me briefly introduce our three panelists. Associate Professor Georgina Stewart has a background in education. Her research centers on the nexus between language, knowledge, culture, and education, and aligns with kaupapa Maori, feminist, and post-structuralist philosophical traditions. Dr. Nimbo Steneland is Senior Lecturer in Management. She was the recipient of an AUT Vice Chancellor Scholarship in 2013 and joined the Management Department as a lecturer in 2017. Her research centers on careers, work and employment, with a focus on gender, diversity, and indigeneity. Last, but definitely not least, Mateusz Raskowicz is Associate Professor in International Business Strategy and Entrepreneurship. In his own words, he's an economic sociologist at heart, and this is through this lens that he focuses on the intersection of international business and society. Georgina, would you be able to give our members a short overview of New Zealand and its context? How has New Zealand done in addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion issues compared to other countries like Canada, Australia, and the United States?
Yes, kia ora. And it's a good grouping because that particular four countries, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, collectively are known as the Kansas group of countries, all based on Indigenous settler societies. But in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, well, we call it Aotearoa New Zealand. I call it Aotearoa New Zealand, my country of origin, to remind myself every time I use that phrase that the country of my ancestors is still here underneath the modern Western nation state of New Zealand that has been imposed by the British settlers in approximately 1800, so very late in the global colonising era, and reflects that, I think, in very subtle ways, based on a bilateral relationship between the British settlers and the iwi Māori, Indigenous peoples, that was formalised in the Treaty of Waitangi, known in Māori as Te Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, which really sets up an ongoing terms of reference, if you like, for this relationship. And in my writing, sometimes I refer to it as a rocky marriage, characterised by both love and hate, and subtle relative to the other countries that we're mentioning this today, and really following a policy of assimilation, as opposed to probably the opposite side of apartheid. And I see these sorts of policy strategies lying on a spectrum, and New Zealand is probably the most clearest example of the assimilation end, and I would say South Africa between 1948 and 1984, the clearest example of a European ex-colony settler Indigenous society based on apartheid. And you can see aspects of both of those in all societies. And so there's a variance in the level of overt discrimination and subjugation and oppression, but all of these countries are based on the same ideas, fundamental philosophies that are based on a notion of European or white superiority and non-white or Indigenous inferiority. So this means that New Zealand does have a national reputation for having the best race relations in the world, and I put it in those sort of inverted commas, but that is a term that you can search on Google and find quite easily referred to in the literature. But because racism is very subtle in this country, it's really invisible except to the victim in the moment. And of course, it's embedded in the structures of our institutions, including the university, and the academy is really a bastion of whiteness. I think whiteness is a useful term for me to use in this aspect because it's an umbrella term that embraces everything from white supremacy to white fragility and all of the others. But it's and we do see this kind of very wide range of both positive and negative, from overt to covert, white attitudes on display. But in education, which would include the university, the default white position is one of the saviour, which is overtly there to help, even that term help, as if the white educator needs to help Maori. So that brings me to my last point, I think, to answer this little question is, well, twofold. First of all, that being so subtle and embedded and invisible, except to the victim, racism is that much harder to dislodge in New Zealand, because actually to accuse someone of racism is a serious insult in this country due to our strong self-identity as a nation for having the best race relations in the world. And I think that's probably, yes, the last point, and I guess the sort of most important point that I need to say in relation to your question, Noemi, is that the label of diversity, equity and inclusion, or DEI, as the acronym goes, is, from the point of view of people like Nimbus and myself, still centred in the European positionality within the overall society. So not really a favoured sort of cluster of terms or positionality for Māori to take, where the assertion of an Indigenous academic identity is centred deliberately in the other side of the inevitable binary, which is a power binary and knowledge binary and all the rest of it. So is that something of a sufficient? It's very big territory, so difficult to speak about succinctly at a sort of a beginner level. So I do realise that some of what I've said might be difficult for international audiences to really understand fully. So I apologise for that.
Thank you.
Georgina and Nimbus, with that background, I mean, something interesting that I learned today, and with that background in mind, what is your view on incorporating Indigenous communities and voices under the umbrella of DEI policies and initiatives? Is this the right approach, or can we see alternative approaches that will be more fruitful, as we educate ourselves and the broader international business community?
Well, if I can just respond quickly, and then I'll throw it across to Nimbus. I guess the word that's sticking out for me in your question is under. So I think if we maintain a bicultural relationship in which the Indigenous peoples take their own position in and articulate in a relationship with the dominant culture. And I really like the use of the hyphen, really as a metaphor for that relationship, because it keeps us apart, so it doesn't collapse our identity, but it also keeps us connected, and it points to the ongoing work that we need to do to maintain that relationship, which is really why I make that. I mean, it is a tongue-in-cheek joke, if you will, to refer to the Māori Pākehā relationship as a love-hate marriage, or as a rocky marriage, but it also reflects a literal social history of generations of happy Māori Pākehā marriages, which have not been socially, prohibited. They've been almost encouraged, I think, and in fact pointed to as evidence of the success of assimilation. But as we all know, you can be married to someone for a lifetime and still have your own independent existence. What do you think, Nimbus?
All right, tautoko. Kia ora koutou. He uri tēnei no Ngāti Awa me tūhui. Just in response to the question, I think, it's a funny one, because actually there is a really natural fit, I guess, in terms of when we're thinking of academia or scholarship in that diversity space. I mean, one of the first conferences I felt comfortable, the space that I would go and put my work into was, diversity and inclusion in Indigenous methodologies at EGOS, at the EGOS conference. So, I see that there's like this fit there, and I find a natural affinity because there are people in these groups who don't fit the mainstream, right? And so we share in that experience, and so we find like networks in those spaces. And I think in organizational practice too, at least here in Aotearoa, it is common practice, I would say, to include Māori under the umbrella of diversity initiatives still. I think there is change there, but it's still quite a common practice to include it as one of several diversity groups or targeted groups that are being targeted to be supported or recruited or whatever the initiative might be. But I think we need to remember, supporting what Georgina just said, is that this is the idea of managing diversity, and diversity has come from a very different context, particularly the United States, and a very different socio-cultural, historical context than what occurred here in Aotearoa. And I mean, even it's kind of come to replace that equal employment opportunities and, the affirmative action before that in the United States. It's kind of been this iterations of development of language and of practice, I guess, and priorities, this evolution of priorities and where we focus, that doesn't capture what is happening here in Aotearoa. It doesn't capture the relationship, as Georgina mentioned, between Māori and Pākehā and here in Aotearoa. So it emerged in that different context. It has different priorities and objectives, and it's not fit for purpose when we're talking about Māori or Indigenous peoples, I would argue, across the world, because some of these things as well, when we're talking about, I guess there's a conflation as well between diversity and equal opportunity. So we have these kind of discussions and we're talking about diversity, but we're also talking about social justice and equity when we're engaging in these initiatives, or we have these objectives. And the argument for Māori here in Aotearoa, at least, is that we're tangata whenua, we're people of the land, we're the Indigenous peoples, we're not an at-risk group, we're not a group that's in need, right? And I think to have a focus on those kind of terms as well shifts that perspective from the colonizing structures and from what has happened, this settler actions to, Māori as an at-risk and need group. So it's just has those kind of implications as well. So the different priorities, I guess, in terms of diversity, focusing on inclusion and kind of bringing in and assimilating, as Georgina mentioned, versus an Indigenous agenda towards sovereignty and recognizing sovereignty and partnership and self-determination, which I don't think can be achieved within the diversity agenda.
Thank you for sharing those perspectives. And, at Auckland University Technology, there's a pride in the largest number of Maori scholars and the most diverse student body within New Zealand. With that in the backdrop, what are some of the challenges that the Maori scholars and students face within an academic environment? And what do you think can be done to create a more inclusive academic environment and better support them?
The challenges really, derive from those the long-term historical and social and large-scale social forces that we've just mentioned. And I think I come from a school teaching background, right? So I've been interested in the history of Māori education in terms of schooling for a very, very long time, and it's very important. It was probably one of the most important colonising mechanisms that the British settlers used against Māori. So, for instance, my father learnt to speak Māori in his home as a small child, and he and all of his, really every Māori child up until at least around about 1950 to 1960, it was up until that period of time, every Māori child learnt to speak English on turning 5 and going to school. So school was the imposition of the outside European world. There's just the Māori education and the harsh disparity in achievement and participation of Māori relative to the national population has been pretty much an obsession for educationalists in this country since around the subfield, the local subfield of scholarship known as Māori education came into being in about 1970, because after the war there was a very rapid urbanisation process as Māori were stripped away from their traditional economic land bases and forced to urbanise. That brought them into the English medium and town schools in large numbers. So you started to see scholarship and research being done under that banner of Māori education as a local subfield defined by deficit. So it had built into the term Māori education was the imperative to save Māori, to fix Māori, to help Māori, all of those sorts of deficit ideas. And then, of course, with the emergence of kaupapa Māori, which Nimbus and I probably both feel is a more fitting kind of umbrella for our work. And that emerged in the 80s with a new generation of Māori scholars in the University of Auckland, actually, in the Department of Education under the seminal local philosopher of education, James Marshall. And we had appointed Linda Smith, Graham Smith and Peter Sharples there, trained in anthropology, but coming across into education to develop a new form of Māori education theory, which has forever transformed the meaning of that phrase, Māori education. So I think that's seen worldwide in the Indigenous Academy as pretty much an exemplar paradigm of Indigenous sort of resistance to obliteration, to put it in those terms, and a taking of a proactive, self-directed stance towards our identity, our scholarship, and our research and writing. I don't want to preempt the next question about Eke
By all
Tangaroa.
means, please do.
Well, because I suppose the point is that business as usual is doing nothing to make a real substantial, significant step change in the prospects for Māori and Pacific academics. Because even though it is the case that here at AUT we have a goodly number of senior Māori academics in law, in business, in education, and in Māori studies, of course, and in art as well. But it remains the case that, we can think of them, we know who they are the exception. So, and so Eke Tangaroa basically at heart, and I think this is the most appropriate forum because Eke Tangaroa, very simply, is an economic investment into the academic staff of this university. So it's funded and led from the VC's office, and it involves the investment into the appointment each year of a cohort of Māori and Pacific early career academics. It's been in place since 2015. It's had its ups and downs. My role as the navigator has only been in existence for 12 months. So I come into a pre-existing program and have had to really completely reconstruct the documentation, the thinking, and particularly the thinking about the not always young, but early career people who've been appointed as not in deficit and in need of PLD, but as the future stars of Māori and Pacific research, and as absolute, we would say taonga, which means highly valued members of our staff. So quite a different flip. And I'll give you an example. When I started in this role, I heard the message being promulgated that I think is a little bit quite widespread at AUT, and it goes something like this, that we need our Māori and Pacific students to see role models in the classroom. I would flip that around. I have flipped that around, and I've said all of our students need to see Māori and Pacific role models in all academic activities, teaching, research, leadership. The whole institution needs to be there needs to be representation from Māori and Pacific academics. So it's, we're fighting this thing of one is enough, and really as the pressure comes on the universities, and this is again a financial pressure coming from the central funding agencies of our government, that there is now an expectation that there will be results, measurable results, not just nice, bold, aspirational statements or, what have you, the kinds of cultural decoration that we've seen for many years. I mean, sometimes I think the way that text is used is almost like a kind of a decoration. A Māori whakatauki, a proverb, as if saying a few words or getting a Māori colleague to do a welcome ceremony will fix everything. Now we have the expectation that universities will make step changes in their outcomes, and so because business as usual was not really having any impact, so I think AUT saw the need to step up, and it's really a matter of putting your money where your mouth is.
I just want to add to that, Georgina's comment about seeing Māori in the classroom, because my doctoral research was actually with Māori academics who worked in business schools across the country, talking to them about their careers and their career experiences and aspirations. And one of the key findings I would suggest that came out of that, because I also talked to what I call decision makers, so people in the university non-Māori who are doing the recruitment and the promotions and everything else in there. And one of the key findings there was this idea that when we talk about the value of the business school specifically, which all of you will be aware of, we're talking about research currency, we're talking about international excellence, these journals and platforms that we need to be kind of aspiring to that signal our prestige, right? It's very outward looking, very international focused. And then when these people talk about the value of Māori stuff, it is about faces in classrooms. It is about connections with engagement with communities, at the ground level. The local level as well. And that doesn't necessarily reflect what academics were wanting to do, right? They were interested in international relationships and opportunities and learnings and research. But because these things weren't kind of seen as the same, in the minds of these decision makers, we weren't, as Māori academics, necessarily seen in that way as star researchers, as, internationally leading, which we are, right? Georgina's just mentioned in terms of kaupapa Māori, Indigenous movements, we are world leading. But it's very much not the impression that, existing, well, when I did my PhD, decision makers had, across the universities and in the business schools. So when you talk about the challenges that Māori academic staff face, I think that's definitely one of them. These different values that we have and bring to the academy, it's a very different, especially in the business school, right? Academia, very individualized anyway, but in the business school, very competitive, commercialized, profit-driven environment. A lot of the basic assumptions that underpin our curriculum and what we do don't necessarily, aren't, incommensurable with Māori values. So those things all, conflicts and challenges for Māori in the environment, I would say. I mean, even when we talk about relationships, we go to these career networking, workshops where they're like, we develop these relationships because they're instrumental in our long-term, career prospects. And when I talk to Māori staff, it's very much like my relationships are my lifeline to survive, in this space. Like without these connections, I would not still be here in the academy. I would have left already, right? So very different experiences. So I just thought I'd comment on that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nimbus. So my understanding is that you came through this Eke Tangaroa program. What was your experience with it?
Yeah, so as Georgina mentioned, it began in 2015 and I completed my PhD in 2017. So it had been running a few years, but I could see it. And I think as a PhD student, that gave me hope that there would be some kind of job or opportunity for me at the end of this. I could see like a pathway potentially to an academic career. So that was motivating to get that PhD done and out the door. So yeah, but obviously I came in very early in the program too, and as Georgina mentioned, there were ups and downs. There is a lot of teething problems, as there are with any kind of new initiative. Just, you know, trying to do a good thing, but not necessarily having everything well thought out at that time, right? And we are still learning. But I was very lucky, I would say. So basically it was a targeted recruitment program. It was about creating space. And so they would bring people in, and then they would put them out into the different silos of the academy, because that's how we're structured and that's how we work. And so the experiences of individuals are very much dependent on where they end up, right? Their disciplines, you know, what the emphasis in there, who the people are, etc. And so I was fortunate to have a very positive experience. I had a very good manager, still my manager, who is very aware of the challenges placed on Māori staff. She's very savvy when it comes to the academic career and career development in general. So she's very good at kind of having those conversations with me, checking in, making sure I'm not taking on too much, and all of those kind of things. I was supported to go to the NASA conference in Vancouver, my first year of employment, which is a Native American Indigenous Studies conference. So that was fabulous as a first year, you know, academic. I wasn't presenting, and I was supported to go and meet these people and listen to this Indigenous scholarship like around the world. So that was fabulous for me. Yeah, and then now, and so the program's obviously been going on. As Georgina mentioned, it's a funded program, so it's technically like a 3-year funding. So I'm technically not still on the program, but I am still on the program because they can't get rid of me. So I keep coming back because I'm just so fascinated with this career. I'm so fascinated with, you know, how we're navigating and hoping to continue to kind of add value and give back. You know, seeing as I got all these different opportunities, I really want to be a part of, you know, sharing that with other people and giving that back to other people. So, yeah.
Yeah, Nimbus, you're like you're sort of like you're a little bit of a role model really for the group, as somebody who's had a fair bit of success, you know, including the Marsden Fast Start, which is, I think, an outstanding achievement for you, and something that I'm doing my best to encourage the early career academics to focus on, because it's A, prestigious, and B, it's a one-person kind of fund, so you don't have to worry about managing teams and students and things, and it's a real opportunity for an early career academic to sort of start to put down their roots in their research program. And with regard, really just put a little bit more sort of data around that picture. So far, since 2015, through the program, we've appointed around about 30 Māori and Pacific academics, but there has been a pretty high attrition rate and so there's only about 20 currently employed at AUT. And so it's a small enough network. Well, two things. I mean, it's a good sized group. It's small enough for me to keep everybody involved, you know, in emails to workshops and things like that. And also, I think for me, there was a feeling that the cohorts, the previous, in the earlier years, were still needing the kind of support of a network. So while it is manageable, it just seemed to me like the best idea was to keep them involved.
Thank you for sharing those perspectives. I mean, it's phenomenal to see that foundation being built up, and decision making. I mean, bringing everyone in the decision-making process as well, and especially early career faculty. That's phenomenal to hear. Just looking at it from an outside-in lens, bringing in Matt's perspective as an overseas international business academic and settling down in New Zealand, Matt, would you be able to share some of your experience in this context?
Yes, thank you, Tanvi. Kia ora koutou katoa wei whānau, ko Matt toku ingoa. My name is Matt, and it's an honor to be part of this discussion. Tanvi, as you pointed out, I am an overseas person. So I came to New Zealand in 2018, February 2018, with literally 2 suitcases by myself, without having anyone here in New Zealand or knowing a single person here in New Zealand, right? Looking back, what was I thinking? But anyway, I've settled down in New Zealand. And one of the first things I have to admit is I was, Georgina mentioned that at the beginning. So my understanding of New Zealand was, you know, kind of the traditional country branding that gets promoted around the world. And New Zealand has, you know, a really, really powerful storytelling / nation branding machinery that works as a double-edged sword. So my understanding of kind of Maori Pakeha relations, and Pakeha referring to the colonizers, to white people, was very, very limited. And you know, I had this understanding that, you know, relations were fairly solid, fairly well, that New Zealand was kind of a poster child of you know, those sorts of relations, particularly in relative to, for example, neighboring Australia. And very, very quickly, you know, I came across the term Pakeha without even knowing what it meant. So I was doing some background research, and, you know, you can go down some really, really dark rabbit holes, right? There's different connotations of what Pakeha can mean. And when I started introducing myself, right, so people were asking, obviously I have a funny mixture of an accent. There's a tad of an American accent there. There's very strong East European R's. So people would naturally kind of always ask me, where are you from? And I always started by saying, I am an East European. I come from Eastern Europe. And it was really, really interesting as an East European that I very often received pushback from my Western European colleagues, or from people that have, you know, were second or third generation European settlers in New Zealand. And, you know, quite a few people kind of said, why don't you drop the East European, right? Just say European. And for me, it was really important as a point of kind of identity. So first of all, I always considered myself as an East European. We have a completely different history than, for example, Western Europe. But for me, it was also kind of innately very important to show that I come from a part of Europe that doesn't have, you know, an imperial history, that doesn't have a colonizing history. And there's actually quite a few touch points that I could personally relate to as I was trying to educate myself around the experience of tangata whenua in New Zealand, right? So for those of you that, you know, perhaps are not familiar with East European history, Slovenia as a country never existed prior to 1991, right? And yet we had our own language and our own national identity for over 1,000 years. So things around, you know, Te Reo Maori, and we just recently celebrated 50 years of Te Reo Maori being officially recognized as one of the official languages of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it was a very important milestone in that historic sense. So I could relate to the importance of how important language is in terms of preserving one's identity. So there's all these kind of common touch points. And to this day, I don't feel Pakeha in some ways, because I do understand, you know, that it can be quite a charged term. I consider myself a Tauiwi, which is a term, you know, usually used for people that come from overseas, right? Tau meaning foreign, and iwi obviously meaning tribe. So someone that has come from overseas. As an international business scholar, then, you know, I was quite lucky enough. I started first at Victoria University in Wellington, where I spent my first 4 years in New Zealand. I fairly recently joined AUT as of March of this year. And the first thing that I did was I went through the Te Hapai program at Victoria University of Wellington, which was an extremely useful program to kind of at least familiarize yourself a little bit with New Zealand history, with the basics of Te Reo Maori, the language of tangata whenua, and a little bit about, you know, Tikanga Maori, Mataranga Maori, Te Aora Maori philosophy. I tried to enroll myself in any possible language course. I tried to read profusely. And one of the aha moments that kind of came is, and Georgina already mentioned Linda Tuhiwai Smith, is when I came across this book that I've never heard of by Linda Tuhiwai Smith called Decolonizing Methodologies. And I started reading it, and like it just opened up my mind, and I started questioning so many of the things that I before that thought and assumed. I was kind of horrified at myself at some of the assumptions and some of the things that I was doing as an international business scholar. And it's very important to understand that international business as a discipline is perhaps one of the key disciplines that really is in need of decolonization within the broader umbrella of various management fields. This whole idea of expansion into foreign markets, investment, extracting value from foreign markets, that is kind of part and parcel of the international business discipline. So I think as IB scholars, we have a very, very long way to go in that regard. One of the things, and I'm going to wrap up right after this, one of the things that really attracted me to AUT, right? It's important to say that AUT has always been my first choice. I first applied for a job at AUT, and unfortunately at that time was not successful. And then I ended up at Victoria University of Wellington. I'm really, really happy that kind of the universe worked in my way, and that I was eventually able to find my way to AUT. Is one of the things that really attracted me at AUT, apart from some of the things that make AUT, that set AUT apart as a fairly young university, 21 years old, is that it has the highest share of Maori students in the country, right? So about 16% of our student population are tangata whenua, so are Maori students, which I think is fantastic. If you add, Pacifica students, which is often also another group that is quite important, we get to around 33 to 34%. So in terms of the composition of our student body, we have at AUT, I would say, the most diverse student body. And Georgina, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think AUT also has the highest number of Maori scholars out of all the universities. At least that is something that I've heard repeated many, many times. And this was just something that happened fairly recently. Up until recently, I think Massey probably had the highest share of Maori scholars. Is that correct, Georgina?
Might be in the business school. Is it limited to business, or do you mean across the whole university?
It might be limited only to business. So
we should ask Tara McAllister.
Yeah, they've done. Yeah,
I just haven't seen that data, Matt.
Yeah, I think we could, like, a cursory look across the business schools. You can pretty much go, oh, look who's over there, nobody, and then there's a big bunch of us over it. Yeah, well, at AUT. Yeah.
So yeah, and I mean, I know the education, the staff in education, but it would be an interesting little piece of data to get. Maybe I should ask, like Pari or someone like that. He may have that information to hand.
So it's probably then related only to the business school. So the number that I have and that I've heard is 10 Maori scholars, which I'm guessing is probably limited just to the business school, and that's something that I heard recently from Associate Professor Ella Henry. Having come from Victoria University of Wellington, where up until recently they had one Maori scholar for the entire business school, that was something that instantly attracted me. Attracted me to AUT.
Would that be in BEL, do you think, 10?
Yeah.
Because it's obviously that there's far more than 10 Māori scholars in the whole of AUT. There's a number in health, there's a number in education, art, and so forth. So, and of course you've got Te Aromatama. So yeah, that's good though, eh? But would it be just business, or would it include like law?
It includes law as well, I think.
Yeah.
So it's probably business, economics, and law.
Yeah, faculty. Given that our faculties are a little bit pick and mix.
And I mean, because what Ella's doing is we basically have a coordinator for Māori, a director of Māori advancement, within our faculty. And so that's what Ella's role is. And so she's been basically coordinating the staff and our faculty and gathering our research outcomes and creating, there's a website now for AUT in terms of Māori research that people can go and look at and see what we're doing in that space and who the scholars are in that space. She's also developing some new content and teaching content and stuff like that. So it's quite cool to have that group again. And I mean, this is enabled by programs like Eke Tangaroa, right? Because we need a critical mass basically to even think about doing something like this. So that's been really helpful. I think at least 3 of us in the business school, at least 3, have come through Eke Tangaroa program. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Maybe on that note, sorry, Noemi, just one last point. So as someone that came from overseas to New Zealand, right? And trying to navigate this space for the longest time, I thought, I shouldn't even be part of the conversation. So I thought, I came fairly recently. This seems to be, this relationship, this rocky marriage that Georgina was referring to, and I really like that analogy. For the longest time, I thought I shouldn't be part of that conversation. I very quickly could see that, for example, Pākehā New Zealanders were very often very tokenistically using Te Reo Maori, just a couple of words at the beginning to say hello, which in my mind very often appeared virtue signaling. So there were so many questions that I had for myself. How do I use Te Reo Maori? Should I be part of the conversation? And as I was going through the Te Haipai program, and as I started reading on the history of Treaty of Waitangi, right? And for a North American audience, this is very much, akin to the Declaration of Independence, right? It's the founding document. It's the moral document that, for better or worse, set the foundation for Aotearoa New Zealand as a society. And as an international business scholar, one of the, the light bulb moments that I had as I started researching about the Treaty of Waitangi is that, in fact, it was a trade document, right? It was a document. Now, what I mean by trade, it was a document that facilitated relationships between tangata whenua and the crown, the colonizers. And as an international business scholar, that was, for me, a very interesting lens to look at. Obviously, the Treaty of Waitangi is so much more, it's a foundational document of Aotearoa New Zealand. But understanding the historical context in which this document was signed and the motivation behind this document, which at that time, at least from the side of the colonizers, was, very much a trade document. That was something that was quite interesting for me.
But also, Matt, I think it was also a document that was designed to forestall the colonizing wishes of the French. So it was in many ways a sort of almost military strategy. Like it was a way to peacefully gain access to those markets without having to fully engage British Army, which was engaged elsewhere at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many nuances, and I think as international business scholars, right, understanding history, understanding context, and I think international business as a discipline has that contextual sensitivity that I think lends itself perhaps a little bit better than perhaps other disciplines. So I'm still trying to navigate this space. I think it's really important to be honest with oneself. Georgina mentioned, white fragility. That's definitely something that I've come across myself, and that's something that I need to be mindful. And then as a researcher, just understanding that, Western science approaches, Western methodologies have created so much epistemic violence within Aotearoa New Zealand. And just learning about how to conduct research that is mainly done, right? Georgina and Nimbus talked about Kaupapa Maori and Kaupapa Maori research, right? So this is research that is done by Maori for Maori in partnership with others, understanding that, if you're interested in this topic as a Tauiwi, you need to be invited, not just have, someone, to consult with, which has very often been the case, and so on. So we could go on about this for a very long time. It's still something that I'm kind of navigating myself. And I think just being honest, showing where you come from, what your motivation is, and being open, and understanding that you will do mistakes along the way, but owning up to those mistakes, and being open to saying, I came from a place of not knowing, a place of ignorance, not a place of malintent. I think is perhaps the first step.
Thank you, Matt. And then with that, you give me an excellent segue into the next question. In the United Kingdom, but also in other places of the world, there is more and more discussion about decolonizing the curriculum. And I think maybe this panel is the most suited and a really perfect place to get a different perspective. I mean, we have talked a lot about decolonizing methodologies, and especially with Georgina's background in education. If you could elaborate more on your views of how to go about it.
I'd like to pick up a couple of the points that Matt made, about honesty and truth, because one of the mechanisms that keeps the white structures, white dominant structures in place is a kind of a veil of ignorance. And in the case of Aotearoa New Zealand, there have been some very widespread mythologies spread, anti-Maori ideologies that have been taught to children through school textbooks. And recently I've been thinking about this in even more detail and thinking about how as little children, we believe what we're told at school. And I think we could argue that we're entitled as children to believe what we're taught at school. So to see these lies, anti-Maori, deliberate propaganda, such as the myth that Maori killed off a former Indigenous group called Moriori, and that is simply a fiction and was widely acknowledged to be such in the 1930s, but I'm still challenged by it today when I'm teaching undergrad classes. So these things take on a life of their own. So agnotology is the name of a post-colonial field of philosophical studies that claims to study ignorance in the same way that epistemology studies knowledge. And I have found it a terrifically useful concept to help me unpack these propaganda, these Pākehā myths about their own history. So for, I think, decolonization, there is a binary. Like we talk about binaries, and binaries are often reified in relation to intercultural relationships, but there are two real binaries in this country. One is a language binary, because we've been a bilingual nation ever since the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in two versions, one in English and also another version in Te Reo, which was signed by all of the Māori leaders at the time. So it has a kind of a legitimate status that really manifests this kind of binary. But not only that, is that there is a real binary, because each person can either identifies as Māori or doesn't, and you can't make up your ancestors. So this is also a real binary in that sense. And I think just to draw to, the last thing that I'd like to sort of say into this conversation is the theme that's been running through our discussion this morning, or for me this morning, sorry, is around identity and difference, and decolonization, and all of the things, equity even, and diversity, really do depend on an acceptance of cultural difference. So that's important for us as tangata whenua, as Māori of this country, because of the history of assimilation, in which my ancestors have been expected to become Pākehā or white New Zealanders and to leave behind their tangata whenua Māori identity, and yet never seen as quite as good as, so it's this double message all the time. But identity is, I think, a huge topic. It is, I think, a legitimate part of my discipline, my background discipline of education, and also I would suggest of your discipline of international business and the conversation into which this discussion is taking place. So identity is a huge topic for us to keep on exploring, and it's a relationship. I think that the identity of Māori is a relational identity, and to identify as Māori requires and entails accounting for the relationship with our Pākehā settler, European origin, fellow citizens, and it's not something that can ever be fixed and finalised and ticked off and said that's done. So yeah, thank you.
Kia ora. Decolonising curriculum and ways to go about it. I think one of the points I want to make, I think, is that the way we talk about decolonisation in the academy, and particularly in business, I think, is predominantly about power. So we talk about recognising these power hierarchies and power structures that have been developed over a significant period of time, such that they are now, invisible, taken for granted structures that we need to critically assess, unpack, unlearn, disrupt, all of these terms, right? Ideally, with this outcome of, hopefully, I would argue, like positive transformational change. It's not just about the assessment, but actually creating some change from that. But I don't think, at least from what I've read, when we talk about decolonising in business, I don't think there's enough engagement with place and specificities and that difference that Georgina has mentioned. I think it's come to be a kind of catch-all term, like a bit of a buzzword that I'm actually a little bit cautious of in recent times. I think, and it's a term that can be co-opted by anybody, I think, and it has been. It's kind of like a safe term. You can go, oh, I'm decolonising, because you're not Indigenous, but you can decolonise. Anyone can decolonise, essentially. And so I think it's ultimately a term that still can be, it still can exclude Indigenous peoples. And I've seen that happen. That's been my experience. So I think that's just one point I want to make. Eve Tuck and Kay Wanyang said back in 2012 that decolonisation is not a metaphor, and tried to illustrate the fact that, kind of critical movements, social justice movements, these moves towards liberation is not the same as decolonising, what they were talking about in a settler colonial context, right? Speaking to that particular context in the United States. And so what we have to remember as well is, even if we're engaging in this type of work using this term, decolonial struggles are different everywhere. It's a very different context. And I think that's what you guys are alluding to in terms of like shining a light on our particular context. I think that's really important to remember. But if we are going to be, talking about, critically assessing these power dynamics, I guess, within the institution, I think it's a good first step. As I mentioned, diversity is a safe space for me. Like I taught into diversity, and I found that to be a really good space to unsettle, unlearn, to teach students alternative viewpoints, have that pluralist, perspective, which then unsettled them enough that we could have discussions about some of these histories that Georgina mentioned weren't taught originally. Because I think people come in thinking they know how the world is, and trying to teach anything different is really hard unless you deconstruct some of those perceptions. And so I think that's important because, colonization is a lie. Moana Jackson said, famous Maori scholar Moana Jackson said that colonization was a lie. It's that narrative that Georgina mentioned about, that we believe because we were taught this in primary schools, etc. So I think a key component, if we're talking about decolonizing, is really sharing those histories and sharing that knowledge, because even Matt, reading decolonizing methodologies and then suddenly, being exposed to all these new viewpoints and kind of challenging oneself, I think what Matt now knows are narratives that many Maori still don't know. You know, they still don't know this. They still believe in these narratives. And so I think really sharing that knowledge and making these histories visible is very, very important. I just want to give a shout out, I guess, to Helena Liu, I think, who is a management scholar, intersectional feminist scholar based in Australia, who wrote a paper called How We Learn Whiteness in Management Learning that I found absolutely fabulous, you know, for kind of really unpacking all of these, as we mentioned, the power hierarchies, the dynamics that exist within business disciplines and schools specifically. So I think that's a fabulous piece. And I think sharing those things and educating everybody. So Matt talked about the Hapai program that he went through as an international scholar coming into New Zealand. I think it's really important to educate everybody on this content, on these histories, on this context, but specifically our Maori and Indigenous staff, right? We also need to know these stories because people come to us and ask these questions and bring these myths to us, and we don't always have the answers because we haven't been taught, you know, some of these histories ourselves. So I think really supporting and resourcing our Indigenous staff, which is something that this program does intend to do, is key. And I think there's much more that can be done in this space. Yeah. So thank you.
If I can just add my 2 cents to it, and I'm also mindful of time. If we kind of look at, you know, what scholars do, right? And as consciousness of society, and if we look at, you know, the 3 key areas in which we operate, and, you know, teaching, research, and engagement. I think when it comes to teaching, and both Georgina and Nimbus pointed out to that, is really understanding history much better. Here we also have to own the fact in New Zealand that for the longest time, up until recently, history was actually not a subject within primary schools in New Zealand, right? Which basically shows, you know, the contested nature of history in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I think Peter Buckley recently published a paper in British Journal of Management, if I'm not mistaken, about how history can inform better international business scholarship. Understanding history, but also at the same time being very, very mindful and sensitive and critical to whose history that is, who is telling that history, from whose point of view. And here understanding that very often Indigenous voices have been excluded from, you know, traditional academic publication outlets like journals and books and chapters. And I myself have found the podcast landscape quite useful in that regard, that offers and opens opportunities for voices that have been systematically excluded by the dominant system and the dominant power structures. So learning history, but also knowing that there might be different sources and whose history that is and whose point of view that is. In terms of teaching, I think being more human, as scholars, we tend to, you know, start every course with, you know, my name is this and this, and I come from this country, and then we move on. I think really bringing your background, bringing your ancestry, whatever that is, into the classroom, being more personable, in some sense, more vulnerable, I think is a good start. And it's something that I think any educator should do, regardless of, are we talking about a decolonizing context, right? I think it's just good pedagogy, that we actually become real human beings with real stories. One thing that I have found very useful in my learning and teaching approaches is the use of storytelling as a very powerful tool in education. Now, in the area of research, understanding how the majority of Western research, ontology, epistemology, research tools, methodologies have created irreparable damage in terms of epistemic violence to certain Indigenous communities, understanding that knowledge is something that cannot just be taken and extracted. It's a taonga, it's something that is sacred, it needs to be handled appropriately, it needs to be returned and given back to those that have engaged in that process of knowledge creation. So I think in terms of research, just educating yourself, reading, questioning some of the most fundamental assumptions that we have as researchers, either quantitative or qualitative. And I think, at least having a read at Linda Tuhiwai Smith, which, by the way, I think has 25,000 citations on Google Scholar, would be perhaps a good starting point. And in the third area, in terms of engagement, being curious, being open, being self-critical, self-reflective. I remember when I finished the Te Haupai program, and this was 3 years ago, right? I thought, oh, now, I want to be an ally, right? This is a word that, is very often used in diversity, equity, and inclusion space. 3 years later, looking at, I'm horrified by myself, just, the position, the philosophical position, of being an ally is so flawed in so many ways. And I think Georgina at the beginning very nicely kind of put it, the premise is, that you're trying to help someone, and that is a flawed premise from the start. For me, as a gay man, as an economic sociologist at heart, identity is the sandbox in which I like to play, both as a scholar as well as an individual. I think knowing who you are, what you stand for, where do you come from, is a good step in terms of that process. And I really, really appreciate it when Nimbus said, there's a difference between critical scholarship and decolonization. And I think being really a critical scholar is, perhaps an antecedent to, decolonizing curricula, decolonizing academia. And, to kind of wrap things up, Georgina talked about, a rocky marriage. And I think, to extend that terminology, maybe if that marriage becomes an open marriage, open in so many different senses, right? Of bringing other people in, but also open in terms of questioning yourself, being self-critical, unlearning. There's so much unlearning after 4.5 years of being in New Zealand. Every day, when I sit on the bus and I go home, I try to have a conversation with myself. And instead of saying, what have you learned today? I'm asking myself, what have you unlearned today? And I think that might be a good start.
So I just want to say one more thing based on what Matt said, because I agree on the fact that, and Georgina mentioned identity as being critical, and knowing who you are and standing in that is so important. But I think we also need to recognize that colonization for many people has severely disrupted that knowing of who we are. So I agree with you, that's so significant, but we also have to recognize, the impact that colonization has had there, and that for Indigenous peoples, that can be, that is a struggle in and of itself, right? Is knowing who we are and reconnecting with that, our languages, our culture, our ancestry, etc. So I just wanted to mention that.
Wow, what a fascinating discussion that was. I was like so engrossed in learning so many new things, and I have the tough job of sort of summarizing and thanking you all for taking the time to speak and to share these perspectives from AUT, a representation of one of the largest number of Maori scholars and a diverse student body within New Zealand. Georgina, specifically the historical perspective that you provided from the time of colonization to the present times, very educational there. And the need for mentors. I mean, I resonate with that, and I know many in our audience will resonate, for a need for that. Matt has said enough, but the analogy of rocky marriage has really stuck in to kind of, understand this in a holistic perspective. And the importance of exploring identity. You so well said it, right? I mean, it's a great takeaway for us as scholars. Nimbus, your perspectives on using diversity as a lens for inclusion really hit home for me, at least. And your PhD research, I mean, that's pretty impressive that, you could bridge that, conversation and the experience with the new initiatives with the decision makers really highlights that importance of bridging the gaps, right, between Indigenous communities and business schools and broadly institutions as well. And Matt, really appreciate you sharing the TAUI perspective. And for our audience who's forgotten about that, it's the overseas academics settling down in New Zealand, as Matt was pointing out. And the importance of sharing, you sharing your experiences, but also the rationale of joining these conversations and educating yourselves. I think we as scholars really need to understand the importance of that. Also, the idea of unlearning really struck home for me. It's very enlightening to understand or remind ourselves of not only learning but unlearning things as time changes. And to our audience, I'd like to encourage you to reach out to our panel members and also read their work as you navigate these DEI conversations and incorporating indigenous communities and voices at your institution. My heartfelt thank you to each one of you for joining us today here and sharing your perspectives. And I'm sure our WAVE audience and our IB audience and broad will really enjoy listening to this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.